This is an extension of some of my prior research that you're going to see here, and it's really kind of a natural fit. The lecture today is going to cover my observations on the main characteristics of cavalry related to the Atlanta campaign, as well as the evolution of cavalry employment and tactics as the Union Army continuously gained territory and drive towards Atlanta. I won't be covering every single battle and every single action where cavalry was involved. There's not enough time to do that. Instead, this lecture, it's really a cross-section of operations. It illustrates the full potential and the limitations of cavalry around Atlanta. The drawing is really good one. I found it depicts cavalry intercepting a Union wagon train near Cassville, Georgia in 1864. Before I get into the meat of all this, there's two people I wanted to thank. In preparation for this lecture, I collaborated with my friend, historian J. Michael Moore in Newport News, Virginia. He's a real Civil War subject matter expert and helped me in a number of ways. For this, you'll remember he spoke to this roundtable about the Peninsula Campaign last year. In addition, Calvin Chappelle is from the Alabama Historical Society, and he helped me with a great deal of information on some of his cavalry-associated weapons you're going to see. So these main points you see on the slide above me are a conglomeration of primary functions of cavalry really throughout 19th century warfare. And among the classic functions of cavalry, so of course, reconnaissance, intelligence collection on enemy formations, screening of large force movements, cavalry operating in front of the main force, rapid movement, which contributes to maneuver warfare, shock, causing disruption to enemy formations, and then dismounting operations, the ability to perform limited infantry roles on foot. But in the Civil War, you really see evolving function with cavalry, and that's long-distance raiding, disruption of enemy transportation and logistics, particularly focused on railroad networks. So first of all, these are the characteristics of a successful cavalry raid in the American Civil War. These are just my observations. But to do this, you have to have extremely capable unit-level leadership to be fully effective. You have to have really thorough cavalry operational planning, which includes obtainable military targets and objectives, no attacks on fixed fortifications, unless you're sure you can achieve 100% success. You have to really have access to suitable horses, weapons, logistics, and supplies to ensure your success. The top priority is good intelligence gathering even before the mission for route planning. And finally, cavalry raids really have to obtain a certain level of tactical surprise in their target areas to really be successful. So just for a little bit of context, I want to touch on some classic Napoleonic War cavalry tactics. And these were taught at West Point, and much of the leadership that we've been talking about today, or we will talk about, were exposed to these. So during the antebellum period, Napoleon Bonaparte was really considered the finest military mind of his age, especially in the arena of cavalry. His tactics from the Napoleonic Wars in Europe were taught as standard at West Point. Among the main participants in the Atlanta campaign that would have been exposed to Napoleonic War tactics were people like Sherman, Hood, Johnston, Wheeler, and Kilpatrick. These tactics focused on intelligence gathering, screening large force movements, and creating shock. The idea of large-scale massing of cavalry for long-distance raids was not yet really in the mainstream. So later on, also in this lecture, I'll talk about West Point's Napoleon Club. The research on this was done by my friend Dr. Ian Hope, who's written a book on West Point and the Civil War, and he'll be speaking to this roundtable on some of that in July. So we've seen this map before, but I think it's really good just for orientation, the primary areas. I think as our two speakers this morning talked about, this chess match between Sherman and Johnston over distances, challenging terrain, and primary lines of communication stretching from Chattanooga to Atlanta. There's some prime area for cavalry in some of this. Now, we covered in great detail this morning the Atlanta War production. There's a few other bits I wanted to bring out. The Atlanta Arsenal, of course, was the primary Army of Tennessee's main source of ordnance, along with Selma and some of the other sites we saw. For example, between March 1862 and September 1864, it employed 5,500 people, manufactured 46 million percussion caps, and 9 million rounds of ammunition. The Atlanta Machine Works cast cannon and produced artillery projectiles. The rolling mill produced armor plate for the CSS Virginia and some of the ironclads built at Columbus and Selma, Alabama. So this is why we're targeting. We saw this map this morning, but I just want to highlight the position of the railroads, and the railroads being the main lines of communication, and later on cavalry targets. Certainly for the things that we're talking about, the Macon and Western and the Atlanta and West Point are among some of the large ones. Atlanta, of course, ringed by those fortifications that we saw this morning, and the combination of those and the terrain made Atlanta an extremely hard target, especially for cavalry operations. We saw this picture this morning, but you see, you can't get cavalry in there very easily. And likewise with these earthworks. So I've got a couple of comments about the composition and organization of cavalry within the Army. And certainly we saw the numbers overall of Sherman's forces, but those were divided into, he had individual cavalry divisions as well. In 1st, 2nd, 3rd Division, these tied heavily to the Army of the Cumberland, but you had commanders McCook, Gerard, Kilpatrick, and these had troops predominantly from the Midwest, but there's other places as well. Union troops from Tennessee that you don't think of very often. But also among this, an independent cavalry command under Lovell Rousseau. I'm going to talk about him later on. And then, of course, Stoneman's cavalry, and we'll cover that as well. Each of these had associated artillery with them, and I've got some examples of some of those. Certainly on the Confederate side, had its own cavalry corps, and Wheeler had 3 cavalry divisions underneath that corps, total strength of about 7,800 with 4 batteries of artillery and 18 artillery pieces. And we heard about Polk coming to reinforce. He brought along another 4,900 cavalry and another 3 batteries of artillery. So in the next few slides, I've got some examples of some of the primary commanders of the Atlanta campaign, but in particular, a little bit of their background of what they thought of cavalry. And so this is just good context. So we had some really good discussions about Sherman, but certainly as a graduate of West Point in 1840, and he was a 2nd lieutenant of artillery. A veteran of the Seminole War in Florida. He did not fight in the Mexican War, but he was friends with a lot of these prominent Civil War generals. He didn't have a lot of experience with cavalry operations, and this shows a little bit later on. From his cumulative experience in the antebellum period, as well as the early parts of the Civil War, Sherman had supreme faith in infantry and artillery, branches of combat arms, to achieve operational effects on the battlefield. He had far less confidence in cavalry as a full and independent operational arm. At best, he considered cavalry merely a supporting function for some of his primary armed movements. And you're going to see this attitude is borne out later on in the Atlanta campaign. Joe Johnston, so from Virginia, West Point, class of 1829. He was originally also a 2nd lieutenant of artillery and was in the Seminole War. But unlike some of his other counterparts, he was an aide-de-camp to General Winfield Scott in Mexico. He got to see how a large-scale campaign was conducted there. And Johnston had been assigned as a cavalry officer in Texas before the Civil War. Based on his wide array of operational experiences before and during the Civil War, Johnston had a much healthier respect for cavalry operations. He saw the vast potential and the value of cavalry raids, but also considered his forces too small under Wheeler to achieve some of the desired effects, and as an overall part of his defense strategy. As an example, so after Johnston's victory at Kennesaw Mountain that we heard about this morning, Johnston recognized the vulnerability of that long extended line of communication that the Union had going back to Chattanooga, and he considered it an excellent cavalry target. He just considered his own forces too weak to be able to strike that deep. And so very interesting. Part of his reluctance, though, may have been that defensive strategy. So certainly John Bell Hood from Kentucky, 1853 graduate of West Point. Second lieutenant of cavalry in Texas, actually under Albert Sidney Johnston and Robert E. Lee. In the initial stage of the Civil War, Hood was a cavalry officer. He was chief of cavalry for John Bankhead Magruder in the Army of the Peninsula. During the first part, throughout this, he had wide exposure to all these operational branches. One of my favorites, General William J. Hardee, he was a 1838 class of West Point graduate, and he was a member of the Napoleon Club that I was talking about. This academic group at West Point studied the battles and tactics of Napoleon in great detail. This firm grounding in Napoleonic style of warfare served him well really throughout his career. He wrote the drill manual everyone in this room has heard of, Hardee's Tactics. Hardee served as a cavalry officer predominantly before the Civil War, and throughout his career he had a full appreciation of the employment of cavalry. So as a mark of this, before the Civil War, Captain Kirby Smith, of all people, commented on Hardee while he was assigned to the 2nd United States Cavalry. He said Hardee was the model of drill and duty officer of the mounted service. General James McPherson, he was also a graduate of West Point and was a member of this Napoleon Club. But he was an engineer for much of his time before the Civil War. He was a highly capable officer, and we heard what his leaders thought of him, but he didn't have vast combat experience in the field or commanding large formations, and this probably contributed to his hesitancy that we heard about at the Battle of Resaca. And it wasn't until you got later on that he came to understand the full potential of cavalry. General Joe Wheeler, he was an 1859 graduate of West Point. He served on the frontier as a second lieutenant in the 1st Dragoons before the Civil War, and he resigned his commission and subsequently was appointed as a colonel in the 19th Alabama. Wheeler was transferred to the cavalry in October 1862 and, of course, attained the rank of Major General commanding Johnston's cavalry corps. So prior to the spring of 1864, Wheeler instituted a new cavalry training and tactics program for the Army of the Tennessee. He was trying to get the Army back in shape after Missionary Ridge and the poor state that it was in. He supported the use of he established several cavalry schools. There were mock battles. He insisted that all of his officers wear cavalry sabers as standard uniform at all times. He wrote long papers on tactics inspired by the effective long-range cavalry raids that he saw from Forrest and Morgan. But he also instilled a lot of Napoleonic tactics in his formation. This made his cavalry more effective by the spring of 1864. Now let's talk about Judson Kilpatrick, who by far gets the award for the Civil War, the best sideburns of the entire war. So Kilpatrick was a graduate of West Point in 1861. And he fought at the Battle of Big Bethel as a company commander in New York's during the Zouaves. Union forces at Big Bethel had no assigned cavalry, which contributed directly to the Union loss there. Immediately afterwards, Kilpatrick was selected to recruit and command a new unit of New York Mounted Rifles that was began at Fort Monroe. He quickly advanced to command a number of cavalry units at ever higher echelons of command. And of course, we all know he was nicknamed Kilpatrick instead of Kilpatrick due to his reckless style of his operations. Just one bit for all of our British partners in the room. So Kilpatrick's granddaughter was Gloria Vanderbilt. And another descendant of his is a CNN anchor named Anderson Cooper in the United States. We all know him, but just an interesting connection to our story today. Lovell Rousseau. So until now, I've told you all about West Point trained officers. General Lovell Rousseau was from Kentucky, and he's the only one that I'm going to talk about in the Atlanta campaign that was not a West Point graduate. He was a veteran of the Mexican War, but he was a state politician in Kentucky before the Civil War. Rousseau proved to be an exceptional cavalry commander, and he was the best performing of the Union Associate commanders in the Atlanta campaign. Now, he had an advantage. He operated in a somewhat semi-independent command, and you'll see that later on. That's his burial site in Louisville, Kentucky, that I found a number of years ago. So on the Union side, during the Civil War, the Union Army established a cavalry bureau to organize all aspects of cavalry supply, organization, logistics, weapons, and tactics development. So George Stoneman, he's later one of the division commanders in the Atlantic campaign. He was a leader of this activity while it was largely an administrative post. Later in the Civil War, the bureau role was really transformed under the leadership of General James H. Wilson. We talked about him a little bit this morning. But the tactical thoughts about the potential of large-scale and long-range cavalry operations really matured during his tenure in that organization. Just a couple of comments about uniforms. In the next few pictures I have of both Union and Confederate, talks about their equipment, arms, and uniforms. So depicted in this picture, Union cavalrymen wearing the standard blue uniform. Factories in the North had massive contracts with the Union Army to keep them well supplied with uniforms and other equipment in the field. And I love the discussions this morning about those lines of communication going all the way back to Kentucky. In other words, the Union forces never wanted for anything in this entire campaign. Union cavalrymen were equipped with, let me back up. The most important piece of equipment for a cavalryman is the saddle. And the most widely used saddle was the Model 1859 McClellan. The North's industrial capacity provided all manner of cavalry equipment, but there were a number of different models of saddle, but this is the most widely used model. Now, as far as other equipment, Union cavalrymen were equipped with a combination of carbines and revolvers as standard weaponry. These could be discharged rapidly on the move and offered a great deal of relative firepower and flexibility while on campaign. Arms factories in the North, such as Sharps, Colt, Remington, Springfield, and Spencer, had these large contracts to produce these weapons. Also, the traditional cavalry saber was used, but revolvers and carbines were really the weapon of choice. Now, on the Confederate side, manufacturing was a lot more localized. We heard about Atlanta. There's others supporting this campaign, stretching well into the interior of Georgia and Alabama. These cavalry uniform examples are in the Civil War Gallery in the Alabama archives, but I think this really shows the type of kit that the average soldier would have had. So the equipment that the Confederate cavalry used came from a variety of sources. Confederate cavalry saddles were often copies of Union designs. Key components had to be procured from European sources to supplement what was being manufactured in the Confederacy. So just for example, the French made this Model 1853 horse artillery bit that was brought through the blockade. Some of the simple things were manufactured a lot more locally, like that iron horseshoe. Like their Union counterparts, the weapons that Confederate cavalry used were revolvers and different types of carbines. These were manufactured within the Confederacy in large numbers imported from Europe through the blockade. The purchase of these in places like Britain, France, and Belgium, organized by Caleb Hughes. The Navy Colt revolver was a particular favorite of Confederate cavalrymen. These Colt revolvers were easy to use while in the saddle and offered some rapid firepower and were relatively accurate. Another one that was a great favorite was this French-designed, Belgian-manufactured pinwheel revolver. But that used special ammunition that also had to come in. There are examples of some equipment shortages for some of the cavalry forces, like we heard about this morning, but generally had access. I've got a couple of things on carbines. So carbine-style weapons were used heavily. They were manufactured in places like Richmond, Selma, Atlanta, and Macon. There were often copies of Union or European manufactured models. One advantage with these carbines is they offered a greater rate of fire than some of the other weapons that they would use, so these were popular. So a couple of comments about artillery. So field pieces that were used with Union cavalry were designed to provide maximum mobility and speed. The cavalry-associated artillery batteries on both sides were essential to provide cover fire, which sometimes could enable cavalry maneuver. Artillery such as this 10-pound Parrott gun were ideal for cavalry support, and they provided pretty highly accurate and rapid artillery. On the Confederate side, there were a bit more variety of field pieces that were used to support the Army of the Tennessee. 3-pounder rifled artillery or mountain howitzers were popular among others and could be employed in different types of terrain, particularly the mountain howitzer. So next, I've got examples of different types of cavalry employments during the rest of this campaign. Within the larger Union actions around Resaca, McPherson's mission from Sherman was to push to get behind the dug-in Confederate forces and cut the telegraph line to Atlanta. McPherson was under orders to push his cavalry forward and to conduct a reconnaissance to collect intelligence on Confederate force dispositions near Resaca. And a quote from the orders: "Disturb the rail and telegraph lines if able." The Union cavalry force ran into resistance from 2 Confederate brigades that were in the area, but these brigades were far smaller than McPherson's force. And so we heard if McPherson had not stopped when he first met contact, he had the great chance that he could have completely cut off. But the cavalry that conducted the intelligence for him was accurate. This Union operational pause, like we heard, provided time for Polk's Corps to get in behind and reinforce Resaca. So, on the other side, the Confederate cavalry at New Hope Church. In these operations, Wheeler initially had a definite advantage in cavalry. From his cavalry reconnaissance missions, he collected highly accurate intelligence on Union force movements in the area. And as you can see from that photograph, the terrain around New Hope Church is heavily wooded, and the presence of pretty well-designed and dug earthworks that caused Union operations to stall. The battle resulted here was more of a stalemate than anything else, but Wheeler's application of the cavalry there helped with that stall. The next couple of slides. So throughout the Atlanta campaign, it became a widespread practice to destroy rail lines. The practice of making Sherman's neckties by Union cavalry was a primary method to make this railroad iron unusable. This practice had a typically temporary disruptive effect on Atlantic communications and flow of supplies for both sides. I think the discussions this morning are far better than what I can provide. But in essence, the closer you got to Atlanta or the closer you got to Chattanooga, the ability of Union and Confederate engineers and other logistics support staff to repair damage to railroads was absolutely immense. Besides that, there are instances, though, where there's large stretches of track that are destroyed in more remote areas. Those more remote areas, it takes a lot longer to repair them. And here's a great example, Russo's raid in Alabama. So, as the Union war effort slowed around Atlanta in parts of the summer of 1864, a vital Confederate artery remained open and untouched. And I'm talking about the West Point and Montgomery Railroad, which provided a supply line to the sprawling Confederate arsenal at Selma to Confederate forces under Johnston and Hood. From the relative safety of staging area in Union-occupied Decatur, Alabama, Russo gathered about 2,500 troops for his raid against that railroad. Now, here's a difference. They were armed with Spencer 7-shot repeaters. And just as an interesting note, the U.S. Army actually didn't want to order the Spencer at first. There were those in the Army that considered that the Army would be wasting ammunition if they had something that could fire 7 rounds in rapid succession. So in the back garden of the White House, Abraham Lincoln actually test fired the Spencer. And he's the one that ordered the War Department to get Spencer on a contract and get these weapons out in the field. If Lincoln had not done that, might not have had these there. But anyway, Russo's force, he had cavalry from Indiana, Kentucky, Tennessee, Ohio, Iowa, and his artillery battery came from Michigan, and armed with 10-pounder Parrots. So Russo departed Decatur, Alabama on the 10th of July, 1864, and he headed southeast. The Confederate cavalry forces were very thin in the area, and the larger forces under Forrest and Phil Roddy that would normally be available were engaged around Tupelo, Mississippi. Confederate defenses in Alabama were under Brigadier General James Clanton, and he had 200 cavalrymen at his disposal, so 10%, less than 10% of what Russo had. During this raid, Russo fought and defeated Clinton at a small battle called Ten Island Ford. Next, he destroyed the King Creek furnace, which supplied iron 2 years earlier for the construction of the CSS Virginia ironclad. And he also destroyed the Jamie furnace. Russo fought and won another battle called Chehaw Station. These are relatively small, but the Confederate force there included University of Alabama Corps of Cadets students. But this is a map of the area around West Point, Georgia, but I want to draw your attention to this bit right here. This is the Montgomery and West Point Railroad right here. And so weapons would come. So Selma, there was no established, firm, completely constructed rail link to Selma. So supplies would come by steamboat up to Montgomery and then be placed on the rail. After the previously mentioned battle, Russo's cavalry encountered this railroad and started tearing up the tracks. From the Union perspective, Russo's raid would be considered a complete success. Over 30 miles of rail track were destroyed, and it blocked a pretty key supply route to Atlanta, at least part of it. Confederate repair efforts on the parts of the track in Alabama took more than a month to repair. This is considerably slower than the other actions around Atlanta that I'll talk about later on. So Stoneman's raid. So we'll get back to the area around Atlanta. So as Sherman continued to encircle the city, all major lines of communication to Hood's army were no longer serviceable except the Macon and Western Railroad. Stoneman's cavalry was chosen to mount a long-distance cavalry raid to cut the railroad and cause severe damage to no longer make it usable. Once the primary objective was to be reached, Stoneman had a secondary approval to Sherman to press forward the additional 50 miles from the Jonesboro area and try to liberate Andersonville, which at the time had 32,000 Union prisoners of war in it. From my perspective, that's a pretty grandiose objective to fight your way through, get these guys, and then try to come back with 32,000 people. Stoneman's force had 2,200 cavalry that was associated with it. Now, he did get to Jonesboro and he destroyed a small amount of track. But the combination of Stoneman's poor execution, and there's another part of this under McCook, when he was defeated at the Battle of Brown's Mill, created perfect conditions for Wheeler's cavalry. Wheeler's cavalry put constant pressure with pursuit on Union cavalry throughout this action. Through the use of tactical deception, Stoneman became convinced that he was completely outnumbered, and he surrendered. And he was outnumbered and surrounded, He surrendered 600 of his cavalrymen along with his artillery and support wagons. The defeat of the combined Stoneman and McCook cavalry force represented Wheeler's greatest cavalry success in the Atlanta campaign. Battle of Lovejoy Station. Sherman's final large-scale attempt at a cavalry raid around Atlanta came and was led by General Judson Kilpatrick. Sherman ordered this large-scale raid with the objective to utterly destroy the Macon and Western Railroad. In order to do this, Kilpatrick moved his force towards Jonesboro, Georgia. But the execution of this was disjointed and slow. Although he had some level of success destroying some rail around Lovejoy Station and Jonesboro in general, his cavalry force was repulsed by a Confederate infantry force largely from Arkansas. And this led to what was the failure of Kilpatrick's raid. I'm going to come back to that other one in a minute. But the failure of Kilpatrick's raid was really the last straw for Sherman. As I mentioned before, Sherman never really had full faith in the ability of his cavalry to act as an independent arm and achieve long-lasting effects. But part of that is also the quality of some of the commanders that he had. The ultimate failures of Stoneman, McCook, and Kilpatrick just reinforces distrust of cavalry in general, despite the earlier success of Russo. And after the raid, Sherman stated of Kilpatrick I was satisfied that whatever damage he had done would not produce the results desired, and I renewed my orders for the movement of the whole army. I'll come back to that. So, as all this is going on, Hood directs Wheeler to launch a large-scale cavalry raid against Sherman's extremely long line of communication along the rail line reaching back to Chattanooga. He attacked with 4,000 cavalry, and he went pretty deep into Sherman's main lines. And Wheeler was able to destroy some level of Union railroad. However, these actions completely deprived Hood and the Army in Atlanta of the ability to gather intelligence about what is Sherman's larger force doing at a very vulnerable time. Part of that is on Hood. He's the one that ordered the approach. But also, if you think back to the lecture this morning, we saw the level of importance that Sherman put on keeping his rail open. And so the logistics and the supply and the engineers to repair this damage was absolutely astonishing. So although he destroyed some of Wheeler's force did destroy some of these, they were quickly repaired. And the Confederate cavalry did not significantly disrupt Union operations at all. So with the destruction of the railroad, the last Confederate line of communication was cut, and Hood evacuated Atlanta. And he burned and destroyed everything of military value. Ironically, the burning of the rail-associated facilities in Atlanta by Hood's own forces produced a level of destruction that Sherman was looking for from his own cavalry. So this photo and then the next one really illustrate that a great deal. So implications for the cavalry operations around Atlanta, and then the implications for the remainder of the Civil War. So the lack of solid performance by Union cavalry in the Atlanta campaign, except for Lovell Rousseau, really colored future operations. General James H. Wilson, as I stated earlier, was command of the Union Army Cavalry Bureau. He put lessons learned into effect with his concepts. So after the fall of Atlanta, Wilson takes over in Tennessee, in the northern part of Alabama, and he starts to prepare to launch Wilson's raid. But all the tenets of an effective cavalry that I described in one of the first slides are applied by Wilson in Alabama to great success. But that's also a function of having proper weaponry and proper leadership. So conclusions. Overall, the cavalry operations in the Atlanta campaign were effective at times, and they failed at other times. Sometimes incomplete operations planning or poor leadership led to mission ineffectiveness, particularly on the Union side. Union cavalry forces certainly had the edge in the quality and available weapons, horses, and supplies. Out of all the cavalry operations, my determination anyway is that Rousseau's raid was by far the most effective, and it had the most long-lasting results. On the Confederate side, Wheeler's cavalry was effective at times. He had some capable subordinates. Ward Adams, Red Jackson, Stoneman, and Kilpatrick, on the other hand, just proved to be ineffective cavalry leaders. So this draws my talk to a close, and I'm happy to take your questions.